Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Kia ora, I'm Paul from New Zealand here at KubeCon India. I'm here at the Argo booth as Octopus, who I'm with, support the Argo project. We have maintainers who are part of the project, and they bought CodeFresh, who I used to work for about 9 months ago, which is a Argo-based CD system which gives enterprise features on top of Argo and how it works. We're here in India for the first time as Octopus at KubeCon because it's the first KubeCon that we've had here. It is amazing. It's full of people. There's been so many conversations. There's a bunch of different vendors here. There's a whole lot of really interesting stuff happening, and in a city which is phenomenal in its scale and amazing with its food.
So according to you, what's the number one reason that companies are adopting a GitOps model for handling their deployments on Kubernetes?
Yeah, the main reason we see companies doing GitOps for Kubernetes is because you go back 5 years, people were using pipelines and CI tools to deploy with. But the problem was, first, dirty data, that your deployment isn't guaranteed if you're using a CI system to actually be deploying the right thing. Someone might run a pipeline that was 6 months old. Your CI system may not always put things in the right order. There were issues with frequent deployments where a patch would be deployed, but an earlier version made 1 minute before then would have a network delay and be deployed afterwards. So GitOps is the idea that the state of your deployment, your end result for your system, should be sitting in Git. So that way, there's a definitive source of truth of what production should look like, or your QA or dev environment. Argo is the main tool used with GitOps to say, hey, here's how my repository looks. I'm going to make the production cluster look the same way. The reason this is better than CI for deploying it to production, and there's a bunch of different things, but the main one is once you know how production should look, then you can build a bunch of tooling around whether that production instance is compliant. With Argo workflows, you can make sure that compliance steps are enforced. With Argo rollouts, you can make sure if a rollout to production fails or breaks, that it goes back to the previous one. You can't do that with CI because with a CI tool, you don't know what the previous version was. You can't look at the last pipeline that ran across the whole infrastructure and know what production looked like 5 minutes ago. But if you have it in Git, you have all the answers, just like source code sitting in Git that you can use, and you can build more powerful automation around. You can have a quicker time to restore your production systems, and you can have a bunch more security and compliance processes around how things get into production in the first place.
So Kubernetes has become quite a mature technology at this point, right? So
Absolutely.
According to you, what is the number one reason that is causing a challenge in Kubernetes adoption?
My perspective around why Kubernetes is harder to adopt is, in some ways, it's Linux at scale. You find Kubernetes is adopted easier in countries or communities where they've already used Kubernetes a lot. So if you're doing web technologies and you're using Azure Nets, you're working in Go, you're working in Python, and those sort of communities and places where you're already using modern-ish tools, Kubernetes is pretty easy to adopt because you already know, you know the basics. But speaking as someone who's coming from New Zealand, where we grew up with Microsoft products, we only know things that use a UI normally, Windows is the dominant system, Kubernetes can be really hard to adopt if you're not familiar with modern web technologies. In the end, it's a system that's a distributed way of doing deployments and running servers at scale. And part of that is you need to be familiar with things like a command line tool. It runs off YAML, which is scary to people who don't know the command line well. It doesn't have a GUI, although Argo is kind of the GUI Kubernetes never had. It doesn't have one by default. The other part of the problem is sometimes there's a lot of interest in Kubernetes. Like coming from CodeFresh as a Silicon Valley startup company, everyone built on Kubernetes there because they knew eventually they wanted to scale out to all of America. But coming from New Zealand, there's sometimes not a reason to need to think of, do I need to put this on 100 servers in the next 2 years? If you don't need the scale, a lot of business owners decide that Kubernetes may not be the right technology. In the end, and I think it is a lot cleaner and a lot better to train up people to build on Kubernetes to begin with, because you'll save a little bit of pain when you deal with 5 servers, you'll save a lot of pain dealing with 100. The issues around disaster recovery, multi-region, the robustness of systems that can heal themselves if a server crashes. that's all in Kubernetes by default. It is a huge productivity booster, but it is a learning curve. It is something you only see a need for if you are deploying things at scale. It is a good investment to make, but sometimes it's hard to see that investment as being worthwhile if you're only looking at having one server or you're looking at having to have a UI to work with.